So, how do I get an LLC for my small business? Well, that's a question that I get all the time, and it's a good question because you need to know this because an LLC limits your liability, which means it protects your assets. In this video, you'll learn how to identify the risks that are involved in having a small business. You'll see how an LLC can protect your personal assets from your business risks. I'll show you the process for getting an LLC set up properly. You'll understand the most important piece of the LLC puzzle. I'll show you how to maximize your LLC for profit and protection. Now, anybody that's even had the slightest inkling about starting a small business or the smallest idea of just saying, you know what, I think I'd like to start a business, follow my dream. Well, if you shared that dream with anybody, I promise you, you encountered some objections. You encountered some negativity. People telling you about all the risks involved in starting a business. And we've heard statistics. You know, I've heard 80% plus of all small businesses fail in the first year. Of those, 80% fail in the first 5 years of those that make it. You know, you look at this and it's not very motivational. But you know what? Sometimes you say, I don't care about the risks. I'm still going to do this. Now, obviously, we have to think about risks, but there are certain risks that we can't get away from. Sure, there are risks of failure. Sure, maybe our idea didn't work. But what we need to make sure we protect against is those risks that we can anticipate, such as being sued. In the event that we're sued, we need to make sure that we protect our assets as much as possible. We do that by limiting liability. Now, one of the greatest ways to limit liability is to establish a legal entity. Now, in particular, we probably want to establish a legal entity that provides us with limited liability protection. Well, what better option than a limited liability company to set up a company that has limited liability? Well, that's exactly what an LLC is all about. But let's take a look at that. You see, with an LLC, essentially we are saying we want to keep this business and everything that's taking place and that is held in this business separate from our personal assets. And there's good reason for that. A lot of times people mistakenly think that as long as I kind of keep just a separate account for my business, then my personal assets are not at risk. Well, that's not true. The reality is sometimes people think that they have limited liability because they think to themselves, okay, well, I'm going to save up a certain amount of money, however much that may be, or even if they say I'm going to take out a loan, but at least now I have certain limitations, certain limits on how much is at risk. For instance, let's say that you decide that you're going to save $100,000 and then you're going to start that business. And in your mind, you may be thinking, you know what, I don't want to lose $100,000, but that's a risk I'm willing to take. And you set aside that money to operate that business and you think, hey, I get it, I'm a big boy, I'm a big girl here. I recognize that there may be a certain amount of risk and I'm willing to lose that because it's worth it for me to follow my dream. Well, do you realize that you don't have limited liability protection unless you have a limited liability structure in place? See, for many people, they think that $100,000, if I lose that, hate it, but at least my personal assets are safe. That's not the case unless you have an actual structure in place that limits your liability. You see, the reason for that is that if you are a sole proprietorship, that means you didn't set up a legal entity of any kind. Which, by the way, it's important that you recognize that if you don't take action, the government chooses your structure for you. That's right. If it's one person, by default, you are automatically a sole proprietor. You see, I look at that kind of like the concept of a default judgment. You know, as a lawyer, I'm familiar with judgments. A default judgment basically is what's rendered against you if you don't show up. In sports, they call that a forfeit. You know, basically it goes down as a loss. It doesn't matter if you would have won, you didn't show up. We'll never know. And because you didn't show up, because you forfeited, by default, you automatically lose. Well, that's what happens. If you don't actually take proactive steps to establish a limited liability entity, the government makes the choice for you, and by default, you are a sole proprietorship. All of your assets are at risk. Yes, that $100,000 you saved up is at risk, but so is your personal property. Your house, in many instances, could be at risk. Your bank accounts, your investment accounts, your kids' college funds, all of this is at risk. But the good news for you is you may have saved a couple $1,000s that it would have cost you to set up the LLC. Obviously, I'm being facetious by that, but sometimes people make the mistake of thinking, well, I don't want to set this up because, you know what, it's going to cost some money. Well, I can assure you it will cost far more by not setting it up than it will ever cost you by setting it up. Now, when I talk about a limited liability structure, probably the most popular one nowadays is the LLC, Limited Liability Company. Well, basically the way that it works is that an LLC limits the liability to the company. Well, that's a great place to start, is with a single LLC. Ultimately, you may need multiple LLCs if you want to follow a strategy that I call isolation and insulation. Now, that strategy may be one that you have heard of. If you watched any of our other videos, you've probably heard about this and you've learned the power of that strategy of isolation and insulation. Now, by the way, this would be a good time to point out to you, if you want to keep getting strategies like that and have access to all of our videos, now would be a good time to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you will continually receive that information, and even better, you'll be notified whenever we come out with a new video. But for now, let's take a look at the limited liability concept and the isolation and insulation. With a single LLC, limited liability company, our liability is limited to the entire company. Well, that's great from the standpoint of it protects our personal assets, but now we've put a lot of assets at risk. As the business continually grows, we need to grow along with it. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, someday I want to have a multi-million-dollar business. As such, I better go ahead and set up multiple LLCs right now. Well, maybe, but the reality is, I tell people, don't go into it, grow into it. You need to set up at least one LLC right now, and now we need to talk to you about how to go about doing it. Now, I know I talk a lot about how we don't want the government to get involved in our business. Now, by business, I mean that generally, as far as just into our personal affairs or just into the nuts and bolts of our lives. But when we say we don't want the government to get it in our business, in this case, we do. In order to set up a limited liability company, you have to file certain documentation with the government. Because here's the thing, I want to point out, I point this out a lot of times, that I am not anti-government by any means. In fact, I'm actually pretty pro-government, because the government has provided an option for us, an opportunity for us to establish a limited liability company which protects us. Were it not for the government providing us this opportunity, we would not have it. So please understand, I am not anti-government in any way. The government has certain roles, and this is a great role that it exercises. Basically, you have to establish your limited liability company by filing certain documentation. Typically, it's with the Secretary of State's office in the state in which you are establishing that business. Now, you're going to file what's called Articles of Organization. Sometimes I've seen states that will refer to this as maybe a certificate of organization. Basically, that just means that pursuant to the laws of that state, you have formed a company, and pursuant to the statutes of that state, you are given limited liability protection through the establishment of that company. It's a great start, but there's going to be more to it and more steps that you need to know about. So let's talk about those steps that you need to know about. You know, obviously, the first step is to establish it with the state filing agency, whether that's Secretary of State's office. Some states have, they call them different things, but it's typically going to be the Secretary of State's office in the state in which you are operating your business or organizing that business. Now, all that does is make you legal. That doesn't give you any protection, because the reality is, if you want protection, that is going to be governed by your documentation. You know, as a lawyer, I cannot stress enough how important documentation is, because it's this documentation that governs the operation and actually how it's going to be treated in the courts should it get to that point. Obviously, we hope it doesn't get to that point, but again, we hope for the best, but we plan for the worst. If this happens, they're going to ask you for your operating agreement. Well, just setting up your LLC with the appropriate state agency does not provide you with an operating agreement. Now, a lot of online establishers of LLCs, they may say, okay, we'll set this up for you, but it doesn't include an operating agreement. They'll say, hey, we do this for so inexpensive. Oh, you wanted that? Well, that's an additional add-on. And they're going to give you a boilerplate document. And by boilerplate, what I mean by that is just kind of a standard agreement. You need a customized agreement for you and your individual situation, your individual circumstances, your individual business endeavors. That operating agreement is going to be absolutely essential because that tells how the business is operated, what you can do, what you can't do, how things work in the event something were to come up. Maybe there's going to be dispute resolution clauses in there on if there's a dispute amongst the members, if you're involved with multiple members, which is something that often happens when people come together and decide that they want to start a business together. We've got to have this included in the operating agreement. So there's a lot of information and documentation that goes into this. When you say, how do I get an LLC set up for my small business? There are a lot of steps involved in it. Setting it up with the state agency is just one of those steps. And since it's just one of these steps, we have to understand, hey, this is new information. This is foreign information. This is not something we're taught in our school systems. This is not something we're generally taught very much when it comes to college or graduate school or even law school. Sure, we can talk about how it's set up, but how is it operated? There are a lot of little things that come in here. That's why you need guidance. You need advice. You need to work with a qualified professional. You need to have the information that helps you with this process. Well, you know what? I've got good news for you. I actually created a mini course that I call Enlightened Asset Protection. And in this course, I go through the considerations that you need to factor in when you are setting up a business and when you are setting up your structure. Now, it's a very, very valuable course, but I have good news for you. It's absolutely free of charge for you because you watched this video and you stuck with this to the end. It's my special gift to you. To take advantage of that special gift, all you have to do is click the link below and you'll be taken to the access instructions for how you can access this extraordinarily valuable information. These are the strategies and the tools that you need to protect your assets, not just for yourself, not just for your business, but also for your family. It's my gift to you, free of charge. Click the link below to access Enlightened Asset Protection so that you can enlighten yourself on the asset protection process. I'm JJ Childers. Thanks so much for watching.